All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our Data as a Feature webinar series. This is getting started, how to set up your Data as a Feature project. So if you joined us for part 1, we introduced this pretty exciting new project that we launched a few weeks ago. And it revolves around this new demo application that offers best practices for embedding analytics into your application. And actually in parts, we've actually added a fifth. In the last webinar, we said there were going to be 4 parts of the series, but in parts 2 through 5, we're actually going to walk you through how this application was actually developed and built. And we're going to be looping in a number of the project contributors and the subject matter experts to share some best practices as part of this process. So again, today we're going to be talking about this first aspect of what we went through on our project, which is getting started with our Data as a Feature project. And this is just a quick look at our demo application or some of the promotion that we put towards it. So if you're interested in just trying it out, there's actually a fully guided experience through jaspersoft.com and through Jaspersoft community that kind of walks you through at a high level what the application is and how it was built. So it's a good reference as we walk through this webinar series to get yourself acclimated with that demo app. And as I mentioned on the first slide, there are a number of people that were part of this project. So you're going to be hearing from the 2 largest bubbles at the top today, which is Sherman Wood. He is on the TIBCO side. He leads the solution consulting team at TIBCO for a product called Jaspersoft, which we're going to be talking about throughout the course of this webinar series. And the other co-presenter on this is going to be Chad Lumley. He was on the first webinar, and he is a senior UI developer at Project 202 who led, not surprisingly, the front-end implementation of Jaspersoft and the overall front-end development of the application that we're going to be looking at. My name is Shane Swiderick. I'm going to be kind of moderating webinars 2 through 5, so you'll see me as kind of a common voice throughout these. And then the rest of the people on the screen were involved with this project, and you're probably going to be hearing from at least one of them in some of the future webinars where we get into the report and visualization development, some of the back-end architecture as well in terms of how the application was constructed. But again, today we're really just going to be talking about setting up the application foundation and getting started with our Data as a Feature project. And we're also going to be sharing some tips that you can take away and apply to your own projects as you look to embed reporting and visualization inside of your applications. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and hand you over to Sherman and Chad to take you through the remainder of today's content.
Okay, so let's, first off, we've got a few parts to this presentation. I'm Sherman Wood. Let us break it down into the 4 sections of the agenda. So first off, we're going to start with me giving you an overview of the project, some of the background around Jaspersoft, and look at some timelines and some of the tasks that we went through. We're going to then go across to Chad to talk about how the actual application was designed and how we got that user experience foundation. Then we're going to look at the actual technical side of the setting up the environment and some of the tools and techniques that we used to actually go and build it. And going to wrap up with a little bit of an overview of how data fed into this whole environment. So why did we do this thing? Well, we wanted to show a complete experience. Jaspersoft has been talking about embedded BI for quite a few years now. I've got a number of successful, quite a number, I don't know how many, dozens, hundreds of successful customers using some of the techniques that you're going to see today. But we didn't really have something of our own, so we had some rough stuff that showed it in action, showed embedded BI in action, but nothing really that was, you know, to the level of what our customers have done. So we wanted to do that for ourselves. So Jaspersoft focuses on 2 areas particularly. One is production reporting, producing PDFs, in a rich way, images, precise calculations, pixel perfect sort of experience from the documents or the data that you get out of it. But we're going to focus mostly on the embedded BI side, BI that blends in, which has been the other thing a lot of our software vendor customers have been going towards. And a lot of the things that you'll be hearing today is a reflection of what we're seeing happening really in the web development market today, right? And how BI, the old hat BI fits in. So we've been, Jaspersoft coined the term embedded BI back in 2013 now, something like that. And I think nowadays people would consider BI to be old hat. I was talking with Chad before, and it's like he sort of said, well, usually by the time you're actually working in an application, all the BI has been done, all the work on what the data is and what the visualization should be to what audience has been done. And then when you're working at the sort of design phase in an application, you're actually thinking about, well, how do people actually consume all this information? So in the old world, BI was a separate thing. You'd have your application and your data and your transactions happening somewhere else, and the BI would be the analytics. The BI would be appearing to you in a report, or you'd go to a BI screen and look at a dashboard sort of thing. But now the expectation is that it's all embedded. There's been this challenge over the years where, you're getting, 10 or 15% adoption of BI in an enterprise. Well, that's right, because nobody wants to go somewhere else. If they're working with information, they don't want to go somewhere else to actually work with that information. They want it embedded right where they're working, right? If it's appearing in email, if it's, in the app that they're working with, it's, the visualizations are right there, embedded in context and actionable. So that's really where, we see this whole embedded side of things going. So apps do it differently. BI is often bottom up. I get my data all right, and then I put my visualizations or reports on top of that, and then I distribute that out to people, right? The apps do it differently. They come from more a top down. Like I've got an audience, and you'll see this all the way through it. I've got an audience for my application and my process. What do they need? How do they sort of go there? So it becomes this sort of integration of design where you've got, okay, I've got this user experience that I want to give people. They've got a product behind the scenes that's supporting that design, and then there's also data involved in there, right? So I don't think nowadays, to Chad's sort of earlier snippet, people don't think about, web developers don't think about BI at all. They think about user experience. They think about who's my audience. And they're not and the audience is generally consumers. They're not analysts, right? They just want to consume the right information, the right person, the right information at the right time. So really the challenge for, for all the BI players out there is, how do you deliver an experience to a consumer who just wants to consume? And from the BI platform sort of perspective, there are a couple of things that we see web developers need. First off, you need those visualizations and dashboards, right, presented in context, okay? Very specific to who's looking at it, basically, right? A lot of the time we hear people saying, I've got some visualization or some part of my application. I just want you to give me data to support that user experience. And I'm going to take that data, I'm going to work with it however I want. Data is often a huge blocker for people delivering apps. I can code up all the JavaScript and do whatever at the front, but I've got to wait for data. Jaspersoft is one way to help you get there. Avoid writing that microservice. Avoid writing that data access. You've got it all bundled up in Jaspersoft. Reports are still needed, right? There's nothing, how many of our customers come along and say, I still need to give reports out to people. It's a document. It could be just a data dump, like an Excel dump or CSV or something like that. It could be something richly formatted. They need to be able to take that information away from the app and use it for other purposes. And lastly, the sort of thing that we see application users wanting is some ability to serve themselves. So you can create all these great experiences with visualizations and dashboards, or muck around with the data, or create reports or whatever. But if you don't give the end consumers an ability to serve themselves, you will find that as an application development organization, you're going to be always asked for the next visualization, the next report, and so on. So giving people the power to go and create their own information is actually a very freeing thing for them, and they don't have to wait for somebody else to go and do it for them, as well as reducing the workload of the application owner, right, or owners. And the guardrails reference is when you do that, when you expose your app out, say your application data out to an end consumer, you've got to craft it in a way so that it can make sense to them. They're not technical, they just want to consume. And you also need to control it. Be very precise about who can see and do what with that information. So that's a secret sauce that Jaspersoft adds into the environment, right? So these are the sort of base things that the Jaspersoft platform can give a web development organization and application. So Jaspersoft has been working with applications of and the base of its JasperReports library, which is a Java library started in 2001 that needed to be embedded in a Java app to actually work. So we've been working in the web and so on for many years, and so things have changed. When we started JasperReport Server in the mid-2000s, it was much more about all your web user experience need to look like a desktop app. That's not the way it is anymore. And the technologies have drastically changed too. Now we've got these very rich JavaScript-driven front-end environments on the client side here, like React and Angular and so on. And then you've got the back-end processes written in PHP or something like that are doing, say, the business logic and other things, as well as having data, right? And then increasingly we're seeing people use a microservice type of approach where the application is calling into microservices to do transactions or get data for what the client side needs. So that architectural change, and also things like the move to the cloud and so on, has had a lot of disturbance in the last few years about how apps actually get built and delivered nowadays. So when we talk about this sort of embedded thing, what are the sort of things that you really need to deliver? We've got dashboards and visualizations and data and reports and self-service. What's excellent? What's an excellent result for people? You need to make it as seamless as you possibly can. You don't want to have, I've got these visualizations and reports and so on appear in the application, the process, and you need to make whatever that experience is completely embedded, seamless, so that people don't, the UX is consistent, and it's not like you're not dealing with a separate product. It's got to be productive, right? I mean, all the things that we're talking about here can be developed by a good web development team, but how productive is it for them to go and do that? I got to write lashings of JavaScript and stitch this thing and that and the other together. Oh, by the way, I've now got to access the data in some other way to feed the app. You want to have, we're providing sort of tools to help you with all that all the way through. It's got to fit with your application architecture. I mentioned the cloud. There's lots of, I want to leverage, say, other services in my cloud provider. I want to, make everything seamless and fit. I want to be able to deploy easily. I want to fit into a CI/CD pipeline. The sort of the visualizations and data world that we're talking about here has got to fit with that. Security and personalization is a very key part of that to support the design goals, and it's got to perform and scale as well, because when we're talking about application user experience, performance is critical. People are expecting things to be lickety split. They're not going to sit around and wait for something to come to them. It's a website. I need to have it work and respond in a very crisp way to satisfy your audience, right? So, I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but this, like I said, people can do this today with a whole bunch of different, bunch of different tools and platforms and processes. UX-driven design workflows is generally the way it's done now, from what I see. People are using JavaScript frameworks like React and other things, or Bootstrap, as I've got a link to there. They can have a complete portal with basically all the templates ready to go, and they can stitch things up. Data microservices generally have to be written separately. The transaction update, I want to get some data from the back end into the front end. Something's got to be written there. We see often that output, the PDF or the Excel dump or whatever, is pretty basic in a lot of apps, even though it's very critical for people. It's not as flexible as people would like, not as rich in terms of the actual end result. Self-service is limited or not implemented in the environment, and security rules are very manually done as well. So, this is the sort of some of the dirty secrets of the current web development world. So what Jaspersoft allows you to do is provide a service and tools to build both the visualizations and the data access, APIs that can be used in a variety of ways in a simple manner to give you that rich interactive experience, the security rules and so on within Jaspersoft, so you don't have to worry about those, it's again in a very consistent way, and we've been doing this for a long time, so we know all the sort of different security mechanisms, including things like multi-tenancy, that you need to worry about. You get out-of-the-box self-service and reporting, and it's got to be dang scalable and deploy anywhere. So the end result is, compared to delivering an application with embedded analytics and services out of Jaspersoft, we find is, and why people are buying us, faster, cheaper, easier to maintain and evolve. You're not writing a bunch of things that then need to be maintained and so on, and you can basically allow things to evolve over time, which is what applications do. So, okay, so I give sort of a bit of background on the project, what we were doing, and some ideas on what embedded actually means for your end audience. So let's now go down into the project itself. And for those of you who've worked in web development projects, current web development projects, you'll see a lot of I would hope, similarities or to your experience. But just at a high level up front with our project, we went through the whole user experience design, and Chad's going to go into that in some detail about how we actually worked, right? Then we started, we sort of set up some the basic sort of technical infrastructure, and got some data going, and then went through time to iterate on the data, iterate on the UI, to flesh out all the details, and include things like self-service and so on various points. So this was the sort of, it was roughly 4 months from start to finish, with probably the first month on the design phase. Ramp up was probably 2 to 3 weeks, and then sort of iterations through the actual to flesh out the whole app. So, I mean, in some ways it runs counter to what, Jaspersoft itself has got a bit of a bottom-up BI type of approach, which runs counter to that. So we had to do sort of things in parallel here, but just to let you know how Jaspersoft works and gets implemented, you choose you deploy your platform and connect to data. Then you build your visualizations in Jaspersoft, and then you embed it, right? So, we really did have this sort of parallel process going on, where a lot of the installation and the data side was done pretty quickly. And then we iterated on the output and the data tier quite a bit to get the visualizations that we wanted. And then obviously, very easy to do the embedding piece on the delivery end. But we tried a few different techniques through the whole project to deliver across those use cases of visualization, reports, data, and self-service. So it was a interesting exercise to sort of do that sort of thing end to end. So we just to do a little. I'm going to again skim through this because you'll see some of it in detail here later. But we did, we had an agile process all the way through with 2-week sprints, and we used Jira and Slack. We used a public. We have a TIBCO GitHub repository, which we will be sending live after this goes live, this discussion, so you can have a look at what we did. As you saw, the sort of team makeup there was pretty small. Myself and Rachel did more on the data and the visualization end. Chad and Logan, who wasn't there, wasn't lined up, did more of the front end work, and you had Xavier and others doing the design side, right? So because this is a demonstration that we had to choose a scenario, so we chose this. We sort of worked on and off with bike share data, which is public, to produce visualizations against REST APIs and so on. So we thought we take that, blow that out, and actually go through, and that actually came out through the design, this piece where we wanted to, present a user experience around managing a bike share franchise. Who are the personas in that? Right? What sort of information would they need to see and do? That was the sort of initial, upfront discussion. So out of that came the personas. We're going to look at the UX design and how that actually came together to support the workflows, what made sense in terms of look and feel. There was detailed design to get the data dictionary out and what the actual sort of transactions and workflows were. Then, as I sort of mentioned, we almost in parallel what we're doing, how do we set up the infrastructure? What's the development environment tools we're going to use? Well, what's the actual end architecture of our application? How do we get, we've got to do some login here, so how are we going to do that? We used, and Chad's going to go into this a bit, how we knew we wanted to use, modern, current web application architecture. So that's where we went down the React and CSS grid sort of approach for doing the front end. And then there were integration points into Jaspersoft, which REST calls and visualize.js, the JavaScript library of Jaspersoft. And in some cases, we're still using iframe for some of the self-service aspects as well. And there was a single sign-on done between the app and Jaspersoft, which is very typical for applications. So, Jaspersoft, but part of that fitting in thing, what you'll see when you look at the app, it's very hard to see where Jaspersoft is, because really it just sits there as a service into applications. It's behind the scenes and appears through the actual web application in a seamless manner, connecting to data. We have a repository database and so on behind the scenes there. And it works in collaboration with the other components. So this is the actual architecture of the bike share app, right? So we've got the bike share. Actually, she's got this around the wrong way. Have to flick this up. So where it says bike share API, that should be bike share, right? That's the actual web application side done in React. When you're running in development mode, and you can also run this in production, it's running as a Node.js app, serving up the web pages and so on based on React. You can then, if you want to, create a static website off that and just deploy it to any web server like Nginx, which we have done in various points in there. So /bikeshare is actually /bikeshare-API. That is the a small set of microservices that we used for some of the transactional microservices that are actually part of the application. So those talk to that bike share database, right? And then finally, you've got Jasper Server Pro, which is the actual Jasper Report server, and and it's got its repository database, and it's also hooking to the bike share database as well. These are all sitting behind, in some cases, a load balancer on AWS, in other cases, just a proxy server. Really, the whole idea being that from the browser's perspective, it looks like one application, even though there are multiple components happening behind the scenes, and that part of aiding that sort of seamless integration that we're really looking for. Just quickly, some of the bits and pieces. So we've got the Jasper Report server there. It's providing a lot of the APIs. You can run reports. It's where all the self-service is happening. It's based on things like the Jasper Reports library and the Jaspersoft runtime that generates content. We used a lot of that. Jaspersoft Studio is a desktop designer for Jasper Reports, and that was also used during development. So you can create a report, visualization in Studio based on the library and deploy that to the server. That was the sort of development process that we went through. And then we've got a variety of other components more on the right there, the ETL, the ADS, Advanced Data Services, and TIBCO Cloud Integration or Connect. We didn't use those in this particular, actually I did use ETL a bit for some of the pulling down data from the public APIs, which was fun. But they're sort of optional components that can help you with your overall application development and deployment. In the middle there, Jasperports.io is a pure microservice without a lot of the services of the Jasper Report server, useful in some use cases. So what do we get out of out of this whole process? Well, first off, we got the data, and there was some. I'll go into some of how that was done later. It's a combination of public and generated and transactional data sets. Obviously, we created the web user experience with forms and visualizations there. That's what Chad's got to focus on. We did have a set of Jaspersoft visualizations developed externally, deployed in that server, and then consumed by the web application. We did, of course, all the Jaspersoft data access in the Jasper Report server. We also created a Jaspersoft metadata layer, a domain, which allows drag and drop self-service, which we won't go into today, but that's helping that. So all this data that we work with can be exposed out through the self-service end of things. And the sort of last thing probably a lot of things around deployment. I went sort of a bit crazy, like, oh, well, we want to, when something gets checked in on GitHub, I automatically want to check that out and deploy the result to an environment so the actual development environment's actually live. I've also done a bunch of things where deploy the whole thing out into Docker, a Dockerized environment as well, these multi-component pieces too. So that was sort of end results of things. All right, so we just went through some of the details of the actual project, the timelines, how the architecture played out, and some of the details of the project tasks and artifacts that we actually ended up doing. So now I will hand it over to Chad to take us through how we define that user experience.
All right, thanks, Sherman. So I'm Chad Lumley. I'm one of the senior UI developers over at Project 202. And I guess first, for this one, let's talk a little bit about the UX and design methodology that Project 202 uses to develop software. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we applied that methodology to the actual project that we did. So here's just kind of a brief overview of what Project 202 does, so in our whole design process. So what we kind of do is this thing called experience-driven design, which is where we understand the users first, do research, observe users actually using applications, how they actually work, and then we gather that information and use it to develop our designs. So like in the first step on the far left here in the revealing reality section. So this is when we actually will go to the workplaces of users, observe them actually using the application or just analyzing, kind of asking them questions like what do they want to do or how do they want to perform this process. And then we kind of group it together into these kind of reports. There's a bunch of different types of reports that we can use to help us understand the data. So one of them is a journey map, which describes how users, the entire flow that a user does to perform an action. And what we want to focus on this one, which is personas. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute, but that's more about defining the users that actually use the data and creating these archetypes of them to help us understand how to develop the application. And then next, once we have all that data, then we actually go through and prototype. So we'll actually use that data to actually apply, the business rules to it and put it in front of users, build prototypes, and actually have users test it out and see what they think, and watch them actually using our tests and doing validation tests to make sure that that they're having a good experience. And then once we're done with that, once we've iterated a couple times, then we actually start building the site. So we take those designs, those UX designs, and actually start building out the application. And then we launch it, make sure the launch goes well. And then after the launch is done, we analyze the results from the launch. What are people liking it? Is there anything that we missed? So we want to go through there and just make sure the process is well thought out. And so that's pretty much the entire methodology that we use to create software in a nutshell. But for this application, too far. This application, what we wanted to do is kind of start from scratch. So because we wanted to create some software from an imaginary company. We wanted to create this imaginary startup. And what Sherman talked about earlier is that we actually decided to do a bike share. So that's basically where you have like a bunch of bicycles in an organization, and they're made publicly available for short-term use for like a small fee, and you'll have a bunch of them scattered throughout the town, and people can pay for them and pick them up. So you've seen those before, but we kind of wanted to design this brand behind it, this imaginary brand, and then build off of that. So the first step, so we did is try to imagine this company, like what a company would bring to us and be like, we need to flesh this out into an application. We need to do research. So the company was this company called Oso Bike Republic. It's modeled after the California, it's a commuter twist in the California state flag. So it's got a bunch of character and a bunch of like back history that we created behind it to give it a little more depth and kind of help the designs a little bit. But as you can see, we've got a nice backstory. We've got some visualizations of kind of what the logo looks like, and then we kind of go a little further. So now we're going to do the actual branding of the company. So let's get some logos and let's get a color scheme going. So this is the color rules, and then we have fonts and the visualizations for the maps, because we're going to use maps because we want people to be able to find the company to be able to know where the bikes are on each of the stations. So once we have that kind of thing, now we can start fleshing out this idea of what actually the bike share is. And from that, we didn't really have user data, but we had real data from actual companies that all open source, all shared from other actual bike share companies. And then we can also model it after other bike share companies as well. So we took that information and started developing a company. So kind of the first part of the design, we got to figure out, okay, who's going to use this application? We need to figure out the users. Then we can figure out kind of what it needs to do. So before I mentioned the personas, user personas. So this is all part of that research part. So we didn't really have, we didn't have people to go investigate, but we actually had data that we can infer this information from. And so we found these different types of users, like I said, the archetypes that we can use to develop the software. And this is just a brief on the right here. This is an example of one. So we have a person, and this fictitious person and what they do in the company. So that's generally what we do. We didn't actually do that for this one because we just wanted to identify just a few personas, just general personas. So the first persona that we identified is the manager, which is pretty obvious, but what does the actual manager do in the application? Well, the manager has a global view of all the different franchises in the company. So in different regions. So basically they have this global view of all the bike stations, which is where the bikes are kind of stored and people can check out from. And also the status of those stations based on what the drivers report. And we'll talk about the driver here in a minute. But the manager's job is to be able to identify problem areas. So for instance, like there's too many bikes that need repair, or there's not enough bikes, there's too many bikes. They can identify trouble spots in the by the visualizations of the map, and then be able to take action. So go in there so if there's a troubled area, they can drill down into it, find the problem, and then perform an action to actually fix the problem. And we'll talk about the action in just a second, but really it's to direct a driver there to go resolve the problem that they need to get fixed. Like they can tell them specifically, add more bikes, or so there's different actions that they can take. And then the other user persona is the driver. And so the driver is basically the one that's going to transport the bikes around to the different stations, and also repair the bikes at the station, or take them to get repaired, take them basically out of the pool. And they need to see on the map where they need to go, so they follow the most efficient route, because the manager can change the priority of that based on the urgency, like, of the problems that he's identified, or she. And so they need to go into the application and load it up, and then they'll see their map of the route they need to take, the most efficient route, and then respond to the updates. And as you can see, there's a little red marker on this screen there, so that would signify like a problem area. And so the driver may be rerouted directly there if there's an emergency. So, and then also the driver can check off the different stations he goes to as he's going, just so they can keep a status on the drivers. So really there's just two basic personas that we've identified, the manager and the driver, just for the sake of this demo. There are probably lots of other things we could have done in the demo, but these are the two main ones that we wanted to focus on. All right. And then so now that we have these personas, now let's start giving them things to do in the application. Let's start giving them, let's start thinking about how they're actually going to interact. So we'll start thinking about the layouts of the page, start creating the interactions with the page. They're thinking about that, how they click on this, it's a pop-up come up, and they fill it out and it goes away, and basically these whole workflows. And that's where the actual like UX design, where we're actually going through and building out these sample pages and prototypes, and also developing, or also kind of figuring out these reusable components that we can use throughout the site. Basically getting this design language defined for the application, colors, fonts, layouts, interactions, stuff like that. So that's where this part comes into play. So now we've got a design, we've got the users identified, and we've designed the application around those particular user personas. So so that's just a brief overview of just the first part of design. We're on the third step. We'll go to the third step now on our workflow thing, where we actually talk about development. And so what we did for this one, so we basically just talked about just the overall design process of Project 202. And then we also talked about how we actually use that process to work on the demo. So now we're going to go into more of the setting up the application environment from a front-end perspective, which is what I do. I'm a UI developer. So let's talk a little bit about the front end. So I mean, the web is changing pretty constantly, and I just want to kind of give you a kind of a more detailed view, but not too deep, of the modern front-end application development workflow. And we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about how we actually integrated the Jaspersoft software into the front end. So to start it off, Sherman mentioned that we used React.js, which is the Facebook library that they use. I don't want to say framework because it's not as opinionated as some of the other libraries that you use or frameworks. So there's also Angular, which is developed by Google, which is another popular front-end framework. There's also Vue, which is more of a open source framework. So if you like that kind of thing, Vue's really nice as well. But React is so we'll talk about why we use React in this project and why I personally prefer React. So why you want to use a library like this is that you can create these single page applications. And what we mean by that is that to change pages in an application requires the browser to refresh and reload all its assets. With a single page application, which is the way a lot of modern sites are built, the actual JavaScript code just changes the information on the page without actually reloading. So it makes it load a lot more efficiently, and you have a lot more control and a lot less of that load times that you have with loading all your assets in every time. They're already there. You're just refreshing the content of the page. Like I said, performance is really nice. The virtual DOM is what I talked about refreshing a lot more efficiently, or changing the content of the page more efficiently. It's really easy to learn. There's tons of documentation out, pretty much for all front-end frameworks. So really easy to learn, lots of good community. It's easy to test. They usually come packaged with a framework for testing, and you want to test. It does make a huge difference. Angular and React both come with a command line application, which helps you kind of start up these pre-scaffolded projects, which is very nice. It's really easy to spin up a project really quickly, which was what we really needed. We needed to rapidly develop this application. So it was great because there's a lot of configuration with package managers and a lot of just a lot of initial software that you need to get an application going from the start. And they take care of all that right off the bat, which is really, really nice. It's got a lot of config too. And like I mentioned, it's not really a framework. It's not as heavily opinionated as some of the other ones. You can actually put React in an Angular application or in a Vue application. It's not really like a framework. So it's very flexible. So it's kind of my soapbox on React. But but anyways, it's what we chose to use for this application for all these reasons. So now let's talk about kind of the front end best practices that we use to create this application. So this is kind of a good snapshot of modern front end web development applications. So let's talk about the styles, so CSS, so the cascading style sheets. What you want to use, very helpful, people use now, there's actually a compiled form of CSS, which extends the functionality so you can have functions. All that repetitive stuff that you do in CSS, you can now automate using Sass. And it's basically another type, basically it compiles down the CSS, but it allows you to get rid of a lot of that repetitive tasks, which is very nice and helps with organization and readability. You want to organize your CSS, the Sass, using a CSS framework. I don't mean like Bootstrap. I mean like the way you structure your application, because it's really easy to nest your CSS really deep, and it's really, really hard to make changes on that later. So what BEM does, which is the style, just the pattern that you use to actually use your CSS, it flattens everything out. So it's really, really easy to work with, can fix a lot of problems. Normalize and reset. You want to get rid of all the default browser settings. You want to get rid of those if you're going to start from scratch, especially with designs. Gets rid of all weird paddings that browsers put in, and all of them behave differently by default. We use CSS grid layout, and what's cool about that is that if you notice on here, I haven't mentioned Bootstrap or any type of actual framework, the actual use of framework that I meant for using CSS. So like the prepackaged ones. So there's a couple of them. There's quite a few of them actually on the market right now, but Bootstrap's the biggest. But there's a lot of native options as well that are really great to use. So that's what the CSS grid layout is. It's a really nice native way to actually lay out your pages. And with the next point about responsive layout, you don't have to have this framework in order to add responsiveness to your site. You can actually use the native CSS grid, and that can actually do responsive stuff for your site too. So it's really nice. You don't have to create multiple applications for mobile and tablets and desktop now. You can just create it all in one application. Skipping over to the JavaScript, kind of the way you want to do modern JavaScript development. So TypeScript is a big one. We brought it into React. Usually it's packaged with Angular, but it's very, very popular in applications right now. It's a superscript of JavaScript, or superset of JavaScript. So it actually is tons more functionality and adds static types, which helps a lot with data. Using modern JavaScript, that's actually not supported in the browser yet, but you can have this called a transpiler, which will actually translate it into old JavaScript code. So you can write really efficient code that's really easy to read. Linting and prettifying your JavaScript, that's code that's cleaning up your code to make it pretty. Linting helps you with syntax. Prettifier helps you with indentions and stuff and formatting that helps look nice and pretty. React.js, some stuff we brought in is Axios for handling the HTTP clients. Redux, which is a whole other ball game, but just bottom line, it just helps you manage state for your application. Just helps you kind of have this global storage of information instead of having a bunch of little ones all over the website. It makes it really efficient working with React, but it's a whole other ball game. You may want to look that up later. React Router, that's just the way that you navigate, helps you navigate through the application. Actually, will change the URL on whenever you navigate to different pages. Testing's huge. Always want to test your application. React comes packaged with Jest if you use the CLI, which is kind of one of the better frameworks. I've actually brought it into Angular before because it's that awesome. Enzyme is kind of like jQuery, so it helps you kind of navigate the DOM, helps you test your application better. And there's also end-to-end tests. Cypress is the big new hot thing right now. Protractor's been around for a while, but that's actually testing users clicking on the application and clicking around the page and testing that those interactions work. It's like it's like a robot user, basically. So that's great to have. Another thing with the front end, the CI/CD, which Sherman mentioned before. Docker is huge. It's so nice to have these isolated containers where your application can run without dependencies butting heads. Just really great way to deploy your applications in a kind of a sterile environment. Very, very good way to do that. Husky, which is kind of my new thing. It's whenever you commit your code, so you don't forget to run what I mentioned, the lint and prettifier. You can actually have whenever you try to commit to your data to Git or whatever your storage is, you can automatically clean it up and not have to worry about your team forgetting to do it. So it's kind of nice. And then of course Git flow, how you actually put it in your repos, how you actually check out and deploy and change code. It's just a really good way that we found to set up an application. So that's very quick run through of kind of the modern front end, kind of some best practices that are good. And you can reference this in the app that Sherman mentioned that we're going to have hosted on here. All this is in that app. So you're welcome to reference that and steal it. So let's talk a little bit about the front end overview. This is another short overview of kind of what we did on the project. But basically, so those first two steps are done. We've got the research, design. Now we're going to build it. So we've got these designs. Now we need to translate that into HTML, web, JavaScript. So what we do is we actually will break the designs up into components, into different pieces in the application, and identify stuff that we can reuse through the application. And then we assemble them, or we develop them separately. and make sure that they're all independent, and then assemble them later. So that just helps you have multiple team members can be working on the application at once. It just works out really nicely. It's pretty standard practice, but I just wanted to emphasize that that's pretty much what we did on the application here. And then kind of another big thing, I know this gets kind of lax with some people, but you want to make the application look exactly like the designs. A lot of our design people want it to be like pixel perfect, like what Sherman was mentioning the Jaspersoft does, which is so nice. But like down to the actual pixel level of padding and stuff. So it just, it's a good, you don't want to have the designers compromise their designs because of stuff like that. So it's always good to match the comps with the actual website. And then basically also too, working with designers, they may not understand the data or the code or how things can actually work in the application. So it's a two-way road. You're not just getting designs and making it. It's a communication. So we had times where the data was different than what we had thought. So we'd go back to design and we'd work around the problem and make sure that we don't compromise the design, but maintain the data integrity. So it's so pretty standard process of working through there, but that's just kind of our general workflow. But that's what we did for this application as well. Another big thing that I'm a big stickler about is testing. So there's a kind of a process that we use called, or not we use, but it's a general process as test-driven development, which is kind of gaining traction lately. It's been around for a while, but in the front-end world, it's very nice to be able to write your tests first and then have them fail and then write your component that the tests are actually testing and then make those tests pass. So it's a great way because now you've got your application running, you've got your component working, you know it works because it's tested and you didn't have to refresh your browser 50,000 times to make sure it works. And then also code coverage. Be sure that code is 100% is unreasonable, but like 80% I think is fine, 85%. But that just kind of helps you just keep this constant code maintenance up. And we did that for the application as well. So you can look on there and kind of see some tests we wrote. I don't think we did 100%, but we got some tests in there. All right, so now that we kind of talked about that, so we talked about the best practices, what we did, our kind of workflow. Let's talk about bringing in Jaspersoft. So Jaspersoft uses this application or this library called Visualize.js, which is a JavaScript library, and it allows us to interface with all the Jaspersoft services in the back end. And kind of how it works, so just a very crude diagram over here how it works. But so you import Visualize.js into your app, and it kind of hangs out as a global instance. So it's just kind of hanging out there in the app. And since we're doing single page application, it doesn't reload or anything like that. It's always there. And then what you want to do is so we use in the React code, we're actually going to log into we've built this helper, which I'll talk about in a minute, which interfaces with Visualize.js. And we want to log into Visualize.js first with however you want to do it, SSO, whatever authentication method you're using. And then the Visualize.js is going to communicate with the services, and then it's going to start the session. So send back cookie or however you want it to do your authentication. And now you can start sending requests through the actual Visualize.js API, and you don't have to keep logging in or checking. So basically you just you log in, and then now you can start sending requests through Visualize.js to the service. The service is going to return a report back to Visualize.js, and Visualize.js is going to actually put the report or whatever visualization you have in the location that you specified on the actual page or the DOM. It also, kind of not on this little flow here, but it will actually, Visualize.js will return the data as well back to the Visualize helper. And then now you can so you have the option of using the actual data or using the actual report that it's actually putting on the page. So that's really nice. I talked about that in the other webinar about how you can work with actual reports, or you can use your own reports. And so we actually had to use that a couple times, interfacing with the maps that we have on the page. So it's really nice to be able to work with just the data. So a lot of frameworks don't let you do that. Another kind of little catch that we worked with is whether or not you want to host Visualize.js locally, or have the service basically you download it from the service when you start the application, and then download the CSS for the reports. So we found it's a little bit quicker if you want to actually host it locally. So you can actually download the actual files from the server and host it in the React app. So it's just kind of, we noticed it was a performance increase when we did that. Here's some just instructions. You just kind of download it and then stick it in the public folder, and then use it on the index file of your React app, and actually import it in there. And so that'll allow you to actually use it locally. So a little bit quicker, a little bit faster to load up. So just a little hint there. All right, now actually interfacing with Jaspersoft. So I mentioned before we had to create a helper class, and so this is pretty standard practice, but I just wanted to talk about it because it is available on the repo if you want to grab it. It's very handy to use. Just makes our life a little bit easier with integrating with the Visualize. Because basically we needed a way to log in and log out quickly, and then after it's check to see if you're logged in, and then be able to interact with the service. So we've got like a get report method, get the ad hoc reports, inputs, get a list of all the reports, and then all those, like I mentioned before, can return data as well as sticking, as placing the visualizations actually on the DOM itself. And kind of the big thing I wanted to note about what we did with this is that we actually wrapped all of our helper methods with promises. And the reason why that's great and why we did it, it helps us a lot, is that it just helps us kind of control the order of which things load, and also know when things are loaded. So I know when that report is on the page, and I know when this data came in from the service, or I'm waiting for the service to return data. So we can, so you can implement things such as loaders, and I mentioned something about here using promise all, which is basically like you can gather all the promises from everything on the page, and then when all of those are done, then you can continue your application. So there's a lot of really nice things you can do with that that we kind of added on to the functionality, and it made the app a lot more performant yeah. So it's good. So that's pretty much what we did. So now that we have the helper, we've got the we're interfacing with the Jasper server. We're basically can add these visualizations to the web page, and so that's just kind of an overview of actually how we did that. It's a little bit deep, but I kind of wanted to give you guys a good overview of modern web application development and kind of how we use that, and then also you can see it in the actual repo. All right. So I guess in the sum, I guess I just summed it up. So basically, we just went over the modern modern front-end application development cycle, and I gave you some pointers about how to use Visualize.js in your application. So I guess I'll hand it back to Sherman to talk about the data.
Thank you, Chad. So to take us home, we're going to talk a little bit about the data side of this application and some more general things that we observed. So, so the data for the app, as I mentioned before, I mean, it's a demo application. It's not real, but we based at least a fair part of it on public data we get through this general bike share feed specification API. There are over 200 bike share organizations globally down to like a town or something like that, that all provide a REST API to give this information about what the regions are in the within the bike share organization, what all the stations are, what is the status of those stations, and so on. So I pulled down some stuff from that to sort of seed the basic, some of the basic information that we needed for the bike share app. There's also publicly available trip data, trip by trip information from quite a variety of not all of them, but quite a variety of them, of these bike share organizations, New York and UK and so on. So we also pulled that down. And then there was a bunch of manipulation that we did to support, what we were wanting to do with the app. So there was a fair bit of going, oh, well, we want to sort of show the status of these stations changing over time. How do we do that? How do we get these KPIs, like how many bikes were lost in a particular period? That was all sort of generated based on some of the the data that we'd sourced. This data related to the user profiles. I'm a manager. Who am I a manager of? Oh, I am a manager of, San Francisco Bay Area, right? So when they could log in, we know who they are. So that was matched up with the actual data in the system. And lastly, there are a number of transactional updates done through microservices, which are also updating the underlying Postgres database that this is all sitting in, to make the actual system live over time. And also across users, we did some mucking around to make everything always appear like it was happening from today, even though the data is historical, for example. So a lot of stuff in that, but it was all around how do we best support the use case and the audiences of the bike share application. So just a few things that we find, across applications. First off, as I said before, not actually highlighted here, but data is often a bottleneck for an application. That application front end needs data to actually work, right? And I often see this real big hesitation between the data being, what we need from the application. Oh, how do I do that on the back end on the data side, and then return that back up to the API, up to the user interface. So one of the main things that we see is that the user experience has got to be quick. We're not talking about a report that's generating a berserk number of pages and all that sort of thing that people are willing to wait for. We're talking about embedded visualizations or reports or self-service or data, and people are expecting that to run really, really at web expectation speeds, which is like, 2 seconds, 3 seconds is starting to appear long. So whatever you do, you've got to optimize the performance of getting the visuals, the data-backed visuals into the application. So it could be some things like, don't throw a huge amount of data at the API and expect at the UI and expect the UI to sort that all out. That may be a bad thing, right? Maybe do some more back-end work. You've got a bunch of calculations and aggregations and so on. Centralize it so you're not replicating that code all the time, right? You want to not have to reinvent wheels the whole time and stopping sprawl. And you also got to worry about scalability, right? So if you have an application which starts having, tens, hundreds, thousands of users, and they're all consuming these visualizations, how do you make sure that your whole environment can actually work like that? And there's going to be impacts on the data access end, on various back-end processes, including Jaspersoft, as well as the front end, the various front ends, the network, and so on, that actually are going to be delivering the whole environment, right? The other thing that you don't want to see, like, people don't want to see canned data. They always want to see it live. So, make sure, you'll probably see this as part of your user experience design and so on. People they don't expect, values to come from yesterday. They want to see that it's happening right now. I do something, I want to see the effect immediately. So you've got to make that as current as possible. One thing that we see a lot is, data security is a big thing for applications. One user is not allowed to see data from another user, for example, right? And that, again, should be centralized. It should be strictly controlled. It shouldn't be left up to developers to do the right thing. You certainly should not put it in the front end, because if all your security is in the front end, you're basically not secure, right? So it's generally a back end process that needs to be implemented, and really Jaspersoft does help with that. Okay, well, thank you for that. Now I think we'll take it home. So, Chad, what do we think about with all this babble that we're going on about? What's some of the takeaways that we can give people at a high level here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so from a design perspective, you should always think about your users first, and then design your experience around the users. So I think that's a big one that kind of our company kind of reiterates over and over again, is that the users are the base of the application. And for the actual application development part of it, I always emphasize best practices. So that's kind of why I wanted to give you guys an overview of modern application, is that setting up best practices, and from the very beginning, create these helper files that can help you interact. That's a great foundation for an application and can help you out in the future.
Okay. Yeah, and just from the data side, making sure at every point that the data is there to support the user's expectations in terms of what they're seeing, as well as how they're experiencing it, particularly in terms of things like speed. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Chad. Thank you, Sherman. I'm going to point out a few ways that you can get involved with the demo app before we wrap up, and I'll let you know what's coming next in part 3 of the webinar series. So obviously, we gave part 2 today. This is going to be ongoing. There's going to be 5 total parts, and the next one's going to be actually on designing reports and visualizations. So today was the first behind the scenes look at what we were doing for the project. Part 1 of the series is just introduction to the demo, and we showed it to you live and how it works. But this is really the first introduction to what was happening with the project team, the technologies that were involved, and moving forward, we're going to get even more kind of hands-on in terms of showing you how various aspects of the application were implemented. So stay tuned for the next webinar, part 3, coming out next week. The second thing that's available, again, this is going to be interesting for you to this webinar series to follow, but the best way to kind of understand exactly what was built, or the easiest way rather, is just to visit us on jaspersoft.com or on the project page on Jaspersoft community, and you can actually walk through the demo application, interact with it, see all the components. There's actually kind of prompts that show you where various aspects of what we're talking about in this webinar were implemented. So it's a really good way to, again, experience the demo app firsthand. As you'll see, that's part of this Jaspersoft community project page. There's a number of workshops that are supporting each of these webinars that we're doing. So at least for webinars 2, 3, 4, and 5, we're going to have a step-by-step tutorial. Again, a lot of those will be for webinars 3, 4, and 5. We're getting a little bit more hands-on, but you'll have kind of a secondary way to consume a lot of the stuff that's covered in this webinar. And the first one's actually going to be posted today, if you're watching the day of July 16th. And we're going to be publishing the other workshops as we move through the rest of the webinar series. And then the final thing, one of the things that was really important to us as we talk about best practices, and Chad was alluding to, we wanted to make all of the application source code and the data that was used for this app publicly available, so you can check it out, steal what you feel is appropriate, what you're trying to incorporate into your own application. So this is all being published on a public GitHub repo. And again, that's available July 16th for the first time. And so we're really excited to be able to kind of share that with you and allow you to see behind the scenes exactly how this application was developed. So those 4 things I think will be really helpful resources and ways for you to learn about the demo app. And again, that's going to be continually added to as we go through the rest of this workshop series. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Again, the next webinar that we're going to be doing is on developing reports and visualizations. We're probably going to be bringing on another member of the Project 2020 team who was involved with the creation of that, as well as Sherman Wood. But for now, I will bid you all farewell, and we'll catch you on the next webinar. Thanks for your attention.